All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. This is episode 79. We're really getting up there in the numbers, which I am pumped about. So episode 79 of the PetroNerds podcast, and episode 78 has not dropped, but I can tell you it is jam-packed with intel. I covered everything from OPEC to the Fed to the energy transition and China in depth. That's going to drop. So be sure this will be a great podcast to follow up on that. But I have delighted to have a treat for you today. It is Monday, April 10th, 2023, and I am joined with two colleagues, which is always fun because it's usually just another person on here or just me blabbering away. So I'm joined by two folks with SPL, which is a testing and measuring, largely an oilfield service company. And we're going to get into exactly what SPL is. But I'm joined by Andrew Parker and Dave Curtis. So they're first-time guests, and we have not actually met in person, but we've sort of met in different ways. So thank you guys so much for coming on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you.
Awesome. So, do you guys want to just before we get into? Well, I'll timestamp this real quick, and then we can get into your, your respective profiles and everything. Okay, so WTI, April 10th. 2023 WTI, we're sitting at 79.90. Brent is 84.30, so we've come off a little bit off that 81 handle that we saw previously. Henry Hub is still just sticking around this 2 figure, but it's 218, so we're not in the 1 and change, so that's great. Dutch TTF is 1384, so really unseasonably, I mean, we're now in April, but unseasonably warm winter there. And interesting enough, and we can maybe talk about this depending on your guys' comfort level, but 30-year mortgage is at 650, but that 10-year yield, because the jobs data last week, that 10-year yield has actually ratcheted up. We saw the 2-year yield north of 4%. The 10-year yield, which correlates well with the 30-year mortgage, is 3.415. There's a lot of talk, I think, right now about an uneasiness in the market on what the Fed is going to do, and we have inflation data coming out this week, so that's also going to be really exciting, which I think is going to be stickier than people realize. But and now we have higher oil prices, so it's just really fun, and the Fed is in a great position to just give us this soft landing. And yes, that's absolutely sarcasm. So without further ado, sorry. Andrew and Dave, why don't you introduce yourselves and what your titles and roles are, and a little bit of background on SPL, and we can dive into this.
All right. Well, go ahead, Andrew, please.
I'll kick off. I'm the Executive Vice President of our Hydrocarbons and Sustainability product line here at SPL. That means I oversee all of our laboratories. So we're the largest hydrocarbon lab in the United States. We perform compositional and physical properties testing on products from the wellhead all the way through the downstream sector. And then our sustainability services include LDAR, stack testing, and some emissions data management. So we're real excited about that product line that's emerging for us, as measurement is in our DNA and the world is asking for more measurement. So I have the luxury of getting to oversee those product lines and work with Dave doing it.
Awesome. Well, great introduction. Dave, how about you?
I'm the Chief Revenue Officer here at SPL, which means I get to play with all our different product lines, the hydrocarbon and sustainability that Andrew mentioned. In addition, we have a large field services group that's out there doing the measurement work for the volumetric measurements, and our digital compliance team, which is doing the production allocation, measurement data services, as well as our environmental laboratories and so on. I get to play with each one of those groups, which is great. As Andrew said, we're one of the largest energy TIC providers, testing, inspection, certification, and compliance in the U.S., independent ones anyway.
And you guys are largely working with upstream companies, correct?
Upstream and midstream.
Okay, and midstream, because you're and you guys are how old is the company?
Next year we will be 80 years old.
Really? Well,
yes.
You have a pretty snappy website for being an 80-year-old company, so kudos to you.
We try and stay up to date.
Yeah, no, that's really great. And I love it because it is this is nerdy. So you fit well on the PetroNerds podcast. So, I know you're doing measurement stuff, and I know measurements was a big topic at the Responsible Gas Forum that I was speaking at, that Andrew saw me speak at, or at least ask a lot of questions. and they ask a lot of questions. So I'm keen on understanding these measurement things, but also your hydrocarbon lab. When you're talking about what exactly you're testing for hydrocarbons. And Andrew, you have an interesting background on that, but tell us exactly for the average listener, what do we test? What are you all testing when it comes to hydrocarbon, like the actual testing of hydrocarbons, and what's that? What are those testing and measurements then used for?
Yeah, so I think like our end users range from, the traditional measurement and allocation groups within, companies to EHS and engineering, right? So, natural gas, NGLs, condensates, crudes, any product like that someone wants to know what's the composition. Maybe they need to determine the BTU, or they need to know what the VOCs and the HAPs are, or the gas to oil ratios, or the densities, right, for permitting tank emissions. So really everything from settlements through regulatory, our data is getting used. We generate 350,000 data points a year, and it's getting used for all those types of applications, facilities engineering, pipeline integrity. I could go on, right? So really, our end users are broad, they're diverse, they're using it for a multitude of applications within the oil and gas universe.
And that's largely so. I mean, we haven't talked about this in super in depth on this podcast, but I have worked extensively on refining and midstream, and it's this underappreciated sort of aspect of the market, I think, of understanding like crude types, which is very obviously the crude, all crude is not created equal and is not the same, but we have predominantly a lot of light sweet crude in the U.S. But that I think a lot of folks don't even know what light sweet crude even means, but it has that higher API gravity, which tends to not always correlate with depth and thermal maturity with the rock. And so in places like the Eagleford, which I think is just a incredibly awesome geologic play, as deeper, more thermally mature, you get all these different windows. So, and that's really important if you're, say, exporting crude abroad, and refiners, or even local refiners, but refiners need to understand what types of crude you're getting. So they do need to know that API gravity, how much sulfur, all the and all the millions of other variables that you're measuring, of not just those two simple things, API gravity and sulfur content, which we tend to think of, but all those measurements, I assume, matter a lot for not just pipelines, but the actual storage tanks, who's buying that, how they're priced, how they're discounted, and then, or if they're getting a premium, if they're getting a discount, and then obviously the end user, the refiner, or the refiner who's purchasing it, needs to know all this information so they can take it into the refinery and process it.
It's funny, right? Because like I think a lot of what we do is like very niche to oil and gas, and like almost an afterthought, but it's so critically important, right? Like you think of like, measurement and the economics of these companies. It really, what we do is it helps them with the cash register and understanding those yields, right? It blows my mind. We come across companies that are just so diligent at watching their measurement, and they know exactly what's in their product, and they know exactly how much of it they're producing, and their errors are, their lost unaccounted for quantities are small. And then you have
Mm-hmm.
other companies that just don't seem to care, and it always blows my mind, the amount of money that they're probably losing by not paying attention to it, because it's not just BTU settlements at a custody transfer meter in the Bakken, right? It's refinery scale processing of crude oils that goes all the way up the chain, has huge dollars tied to it, and we can do that. We can take oil and do a full refinery simulated distillation and tell them exactly how that those hydrocarbon components are going to break out, through whatever grade they're looking for. So we do that all day. We have 13 labs in the U.S. We have a fuels and lubricants division that does quite a bit of jet fuel and gasoline testing, and we've got a bunch of environmental labs now that are helping customers with other environmental aspects outside of oil and gas as well.
And then,
Another important part of that, Andrew, is also going back upstream. So yes, all those refineries, they need to know what's going in them. They can make the decision, but somebody contributed to that. There's thousands of wells that are contributing to that stream that are going into that refinery. So each one of those mineral interest owners, each one of those midstream companies that are receiving it, need to know what their contribution is and how it got there. And so determining what that is and how you get it back to the wellhead to know that that person is owed this much for their products is a big piece of it as well, not just in the measurement, but in the allocation part. So it
Yeah,
becomes important.
it's a very it is a very nerdy, sort of probably underappreciated aspect of the business that everyone has to know exactly what they're getting, and where it's coming from and how that works, so everyone's paid appropriately. So that is very fascinating. We can definitely touch on we can definitely touch on a little more of the business aspects and your guys' perspective in terms of what's going on within the market. I would love to hear that, and certainly on the environmental side, are you guys measuring methane emissions, and in that space of this, the hyperactivity and sensitivity on the every upstream provider lowering their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions? I assume you're playing or at least you're entered and into that foray at the moment.
Yeah, we're building out our LDAR and stack capabilities. We've brought on a few guys as of last year and actively building out that practice. Yep.
Okay, cool. And where is that have most concentrated in the market? Where would
Yeah.
you say is the
So right now it's in Texas and Louisiana. That's where most of our activity actually. We've got bites coming from the Bakken and the DJ. Here in Colorado, it's a bit different, I would say, especially with respect to the regulatory environment and how people look at traditional LDAR versus like continuous monitoring and what the state's asking them to do. So, but the Bakken is great. Permian, huge, obviously Eagleford, Haynesville. We're opening up in the Marcellus pretty soon. We're going to have a FLIR camera
okay?
there. So yeah, really excited about how that really fits into the DNA of our business.
One of the
Okay.
cool things about that is, we have 250 technicians that are out touching our client sites every day. They're hitting 5 to 6 sites. And so each one of those that we outfit with an LDAR camera can go out there and perform that test and really maximize the benefit for the customers. So rather than having to send out different groups each time to do different work, we can capture it all in one run, save them money, get their compliance data and their settlement data all at the same time.
Okay. All right. Very cool. Very cool. Well, we can maybe we'll touch on a little more of that. We'll see where this podcast goes. But you guys are welcome. As I said before, you're welcome to interrupt and interject and ask questions. But there's a few things so overview for listeners and folks. There's a few topics I would like to cover, which is I definitely want to talk a bit about the Responsible Gas Forum. I know that's Chatham House rules, but I always tell people I'm always on the record, so I don't mind everything that I said, which is a little provocative in a group like that. Um, and then I would like to, obviously, I want to talk about the oil market. I mean, I haven't, we've had a pretty wild ride in just a week and a day of oil prices from, the OPEC only announced their cuts just a week ago on Sunday. So we went from 69 bucks on St. Patrick's Day to 80 bucks, and we've been hanging at this 80, 81. Now we're at 79. Obviously, that the only reason we're dipping down to 79 right now is because we have pressure that the thought that we're going to have a higher inflation rate and that the Fed's probably going to, not even the higher inflation rate, is more the jobs number, that the Fed's going to probably raise rates. The Fed was going to have to raise rates anyway, but the market's going to do what the market's going to do and poorly interpret things. And then I think there's a couple things of I think the overall business sentiment. I love to get when I have guests on the podcast, and especially service companies, is really how do you see the state of business right now? I mean, I think inflation is a huge piece. Labor is always important, and I always have guests on the podcast when it's inflation, it's labor, have you had any pains or stickiness? Obviously, you're an 80-year-old business, so it's a little bit different in this space. But I mean, what's your vantage point? Obviously, on the upstream, I know that we are. We just on, and I missed this on Friday, but I mean Friday the rumor came out, or not the rumor, the established rumor, and with the Wall Street Journal, that it wasn't just a rumor, that Exxon was actually talking to, both parties said that they were talking to each other. Exxon was talking to Pioneer Natural Resources, which we all know in this space, if you know Exxon or Pioneer Natural Resources, they are mega players. And Pioneer Natural Resources is technically, I mean, they are an independent oil company. They are a pure play Permian producer, one of the biggest and first big Permian companies. And that would be a monstrous acquisition. So, if that begins, and that'll be an there'll be an I've been hearing talks, and people have been asking about this for a while, but usually when it starts, others follow suit. And this is on the back of these companies having so much cash, probably wanting to buy inventory, not getting rewarded by the shareholders no matter what they do. So hey, might as well buy these companies, because these oil companies, as much as they won't tell you publicly that oil is going to be around forever, they do know that. So they're going to buy up other companies, and they're going to have this production in their back pocket, which would massively increase Exxon's production profile. But it has significant impacts for the service sector, for activity, for what's going on in the state of the market. So that's just something to throw out there. But I don't know where you want to start. If we want to start with, maybe we can talk. I think gas is a nice place, the responsible gas forum. So Dave, Andrew, you're welcome to bring up if this is a good place to start. We can talk about natural gas, this responsible gas forum, and then we can get into the market and how you guys are seeing things.
Let's talk about the Pain Institute because for a minute, because yeah, first time I guess I'd known of you, right? But got to see you in action, and you were fiery, right? And the poor panelists up there talking about their continuous monitoring technologies, and painting this perfectly wonderful picture of the world and emissions technology, and there you are to kind of give them a dose of reality, right? And like I start with like, what does it even mean? So there's the Gas Processors Association, GPA Midstream. I'm leading a work group trying to add some definition around like, what does responsibly sourced gas mean? What does certified natural gas mean? What does differentiated natural gas mean? Like, people use them interchangeably, but to
And
me, they're all
this
a
was
little
a
bit
big
different.
topic. Just to don't mean to cut you off, but that was so the responsible gas symposium was a thing at the Pain at School Mines with the
Yes.
Pain Institute, which is the policy arm. And there was a lot of Chatham House rules, so we're not going to say who was saying what, but it was a pretty wide swath of regulatory folks and industry folks in the room, and some really good panels actually. But there was a lot of talk. I mean, there seemed to be sort of an overwhelming thread of this measurement of the bill, measuring actual this gets back to CO2 emissions, but measuring the emissions from natural gas and sort of certifying that. And then no one really talked about the end user, the hope, but the hope is obviously that, hey, Europe's going to really want my natural gas more because I've measured it. And and I'm not faulting anyone for being in that business, but I do think there's a bigger sort of world out there in terms of the reality of the 4 BCF a day of gas that's declined from 6 BCF a day to 4 BCF a day in Colorado, and the immense regulatory hurdles in Colorado that Colorado is looking a lot more like California for declining production. So given that we were both there, and we don't have to speak to other people's, but yeah, you were seeing the same stuff I was, and it was just a very interesting sort of characterization of a problem, and solutions to a problem that don't necessarily. I mean, I don't even know how much natural gas currently in Colorado is being exported. Exported abroad, which was a statistic that was not brought up.
Yeah, and I heard that part of the reason P66 was interested in DCP was kind of providing that Gulf Coast access through their pipeline
Absolutely, yeah.
system. And but yeah, I mean, for me, one of the big takeaways was Cheniere. Cheniere doesn't buy any of it, right? And I thought that was really interesting as the largest purchaser of natural gas in the United States. The work that they're doing with, QMRV and making sure that the data is there to back up the product. Um, I thought that was a really interesting statement. That, hey, we don't buy 8 BCF a day or something like that, and we don't buy a single bit of responsibly sourced gas yet. I thought that was really
Yeah,
interesting.
and
Can I ask?
that's sorry, yeah, go ahead, please.
I want to ask a question because I wasn't here, and Trish, you triggered something for me. You were saying that they were talking a lot about measurement. Andrew
Mhm.
and I have spoke to a lot of companies that these companies are the ones that want to be the certifiers. They're the ones that want to provide the quote unquote data to make sure so that folks can say, listen, we've got responsibly sourced gas. But the one common theme that we found across it was they really didn't care about empirical measurement. They wanted to have some magic formula that would then you could say, oh, now I'm responsible. What were you hearing in this forum when you say measurement? Were they really talking about true empirical measurement of the emissions to show that they were reducing it, to show that they were low carbon?
Yeah, they were. I mean, there was an overwhelming. There was a few panels on this that I believe that that's public knowledge. But there was a few panels on this to talk about the really granular, nerdy stuff of actual measuring it. Now, I think there's probably a lot of debate on and in that whole deep space of I assume there's a great amount of debate on the whole deep space of measuring and that certification. And I know from just the I work with a lot of service companies, and I can tell you I had a lot of phone calls between 2020 and 2021 in 2 years of every company trying to get in on this. And whatever green it was, they were just grabbing it and running with it. They didn't even know what it was, they were just going to get into it. I think the scope 1 and scope 2 thing is certainly something that is people are talking about it. The problem is it's a lot like talking about the energy transition and ESG broadly, is that there isn't a definition until it's forced upon people. And Colorado does have much higher we have much higher air quality standards in terms of actual drilling and producing. But the actual, I think, scope 1 and scope 2 emissions from the wellhead, which is something that Diamondback was one of the. I mean, Diamondback and others were pretty early on talking in their earnings call about flyovers and measuring. And not saying that other companies weren't already doing that, but they were vocal pretty early on in terms of a public earnings call space about talking about this, because and this was becoming trendy. So I get a little bit hesitant on this stuff because it's kind of like where everybody hypes themselves up. And so one company talks about it, another company talks about it, and everybody thinks we got to do this. And the question is, what are they actually measuring? What are they certifying? And the problem I have with it is that I need from a market standpoint of knowing where these molecules are going to end up going. And if they have a market, is that who has said I need the certification, and who's qualified this and demanded it, and does it have the pipeline and all the access and to get there? Does it have the infrastructure to actually get there? Because if you're certifying, if everyone in Colorado certified every single molecule that came out as whatever, we hit these scope 1, scope 2 emissions targets, and we're the cleanest natural gas in the world. Are we certain that those 4 BCF a day can get from Colorado to the Gulf Coast and to Europe? And that's not, there's a lot in there. That's just like transporting crude oil, and you have to actually develop a market for it. So I know the Europeans have been talking more about having extra having certification for this. I'm also pretty pissed at that because they weren't requiring certification for clean molecules from Russia, but now that they're not getting it from Russia, they are requiring us to do it. And I think that's. I'm not saying that the industry shouldn't do a better job and reduce their emissions and things that they can improve. Absolutely, but that's just an energy secure. I mean, that's just ridiculous that you're okay getting it from a a foreign power that has no rule of law and has invaded. The fact that you're okay with this structure, but now you're penalizing the countries that actually show the data. And Europe has been talking about this for a couple of years. I know France was calling our gas dirty. They said they were never going to take it. And this was a few years ago, well before the war in Ukraine. And that there was a lot of talk about how they were actually measuring this, right? They were measuring U.S. natural gas based on doing these methane emissions and everything based on some broad calculations. Now there's a lot of debate on if you get more granular, is our data worse, is it better? But I mean, methane emissions are one thing, and from my understanding, you can reduce those you know it's pretty easy for new production to reduce their emissions lickety split, and actually not so hard for even older production to reduce their emissions pretty quickly as well. From my understanding, it's some of the older stuff that you really have to get in there and reduce this. But I have a feeling that technology grows pretty quickly, and that when you ask companies to do something, I've grown up around this business, and when you ask operators to do something, you just tell them how to do it. This is what you have to do, and usually these very smart engineers, they figure out how to way to do it pretty quickly, and they just comply. So I just think we haven't defined this. I don't know if that answers your question. That's a little long-winded, but I'd love to know your response.
No, I think that was great, and I think you hit on a lot of it. Again, I share your annoyance at how we're viewed versus other countries. That's bothersome, and I agree with you. We've seen them. I worked for one of the big major independents, and if they're asked to do something, they find a way to get it done. I do think there's some limitation in that. There's big
Right.
companies now that are buying up a ton of the low producing older systems that there's just not a lot of dollars around those. So they don't have
Right.
a lot of money
Right.
to put in them. And so that's where the problem's going to lie. It's like you said, new production's no problem. fairly recent production's no problem. It's all that way old production that's just dribbling out a little bit of gas and a little bit of oil that they just don't have the economics to put into it. That's going to be the holdup.
Right. And I again, I am hesitant on pushing pushing these guys too far, is because cumulatively stripper wells and all these a barrel day here, a barrel day there, 200 barrels a day here, 200 barrels a day there, they add up pretty quickly. And so I am, you know, I know listeners have to be questioning where I stand on the climate stuff, and I am essentially at the point where the U.S. killing themselves to do all this, unless we address all the emissions elsewhere, it's really all for naught. So, I am very hesitant to be advocating to impose very strict regulations on measuring stripper wells in this country, which would impose, we've already seen in Colorado the push to actually, plug and abandon, plug these wells. Not I'm saying that before the time, but there are a lot of companies in Colorado that have plugged their vertical production, and I think that vertical production, I think all this production, and we need to be thinking from an energy security standpoint of, my dad pumped vertical wells for almost my entire has pumped my entire life and before, and so you have to just be very cognizant of, when you're taking stuff offline, what that actually means, especially in the name of the environment, when if you're not actually doing anything and you're playing whack-a-mole. So I think that's extremely important to think about when we're taking production offline. That doesn't mean that we can't sort of work toward technological advances in solving that. But I do realize from, as you said, that this seems to be the simplest thing, is that some of the oldest stuff, the economics simply aren't there, whereas the newer stuff it is. At the end of the day, I'd still like to see the data of, if we got rid of every single drop in production in the U.S., what would the impact be in terms of the total global output of methane emissions?
Yeah, agreed.
Andrew, thoughts?
I feel like I could go a million different directions with that. I mean, on the whole thing on these stripper wells and these low flow wells, I think there are, like you were pointing out, a lot of unintended consequences with forcing people to do things that are uneconomical or not practical with some of these assets. And I think back to 2 years ago, Shell, I believe it was Shell, lost a lawsuit in Dutch court that they were basically mandated by Dutch law to cut their CO2 emissions in half, I think, which is
Right.
not a practical ask in 10 years of a company like that. And so, what you're seeing, I think, a number of companies do now is dump those assets. They're saying, well, I can't do anything about it. So I'm going to get those emissions off my books because I'll look like I did something. But what they're really doing is playing emissions hot potato with a producer who ultimately is going to operate those resources less responsibly and has less capital to do, something with those assets than someone like Shell, right? BP did it with Hillcorp in Alaska,
Yep.
I
As I
believe,
say, you're hitting
as
it.
well. And so it's emissions hot potato. So what's the benefit to what you're asking? And the problem is, all three of us would get labeled as anti clean energy or anti climate change people. I don't think the three of us at all have those sentiments. I'm pro environment. Dave's pro environment. Pretty sure you are, Trisha. But people want to play this labeling game when you don't want to conform to the status quo and
So
the narrative
can you
right now that's being written.
Can you tell us in the business, how's that actually playing out? So that's but something, initially in this podcast I talked pretty extensively about, is that, when BP sold off Hillcorp and everybody's selling off these assets, or, shoving, selling them off to other companies, and largely it's private companies that are taking this. And, we saw the rise of the private operator, in just an incredible story of private operator, that behavior, and just the willingness to lean in on higher prices, as prices were riding up since negative oil prices, basically since that moment they turned positive. Everybody, the private operators were there, and chomping at the bit and going to town on production. We've seen them come, obviously gas prices have impacted that significantly, of privates in the gas space, and wildcatting for gas is no longer something that people want to do at $2 an MCF. But on the oil side, this rebound in oil prices, any softness that you had, sort of these privates are back. It's going to be appealing again. And we did see some softness, I think, in around September, when things were softening out. You see the rig count react really quickly from the privates. But something at this symposium, and some comments, some conversations I was having was, in the Permian Basin, you have a mix of operators, right? You have a ton of private operators and you have a ton of public operators. And so the incentives for both these different companies are very, very different. And now, especially when you have energy transition and ESG, and you have these public operators just have a unique, differentiated set of pressures that they did not have years ago, even though they're rolling in cash and prices are good and they can produce all this stuff. So from your standpoint, from a business standpoint, in terms of, and maybe not you, I mean, you guys specifically, but if you see overall from actually from the measurement side and actually wanting to get ahead of this scope 1, scope 2, is it more privates or is it more publics? And whose willingness to adapt to this? Because I agree with you that Hillcorp and others, I mean, BP was probably lying through their teeth when they said they had the lowest emissions in the world in Russia, which clearly was, that's just ridiculous, and they couldn't prove that. But they said that in an earnings call when they were having this debate, well before the Ukraine stuff. But yeah, now, I mean, forget, no one has tracking emissions in Russia because they let go of all their assets. It's just gone. So we forget about that. But I mean, are your business right now? Are you seeing what does it look like for publics and privates in this particular space?
So I guess I can start, and I'll let Dave. You can piggyback off that. I mean, I think with the publics, they're they're trying to be proactive, but also work through the internal bureaucracy right now when it comes to dealing with how they go about measuring, reporting, and ultimately being held accountable by the shareholder as well as the general consuming public. I think the privates, at least from my perspective, have been quicker to say, and there are privates that simply just don't seem to want to do anything until they get slapped with a fine or get caught. But they're the ones that are quicker to outsource to a company and say, take this headache off my plate, take care of it, and I can go on with my day. Because they don't have to worry about some of the public facing pressures that I think are
Right.
mounting on public companies. Dave?
And
No, I
sorry, no, go ahead,
yeah,
go ahead.
Tricia, I'm sorry.
No, Dave, I want to hear you. Go, have at it.
As you say, I think you're spot on. I think you're starting to see a little bit of a change there. So, as the pressures have been ramping down just a little bit, I think people are seeing the pendulum is starting to swing back, and they're not going to have all this on them. The desire for profitability versus trying to, for lack of a better term, greenwash what they're doing.
Right.
I think we're going to start swinging back on the publics as well as the privates. But like Andrew said, the privates have been more willing to offload that to somebody, let them take care of it, and then get on with their day. I think that was spot on.
And I'm guessing the big, a big public company isn't necessary. I mean, part of this is something they would want to do in house, and even some big independents, I'd imagine, is something that they either have been working on this on their own tech, and they may want to do this in house. And I do agree. I mean, I think bureaucracy. If you've ever dealt with government or a large oil company, you understand it's very hard to get things done quickly. Whereas I mean, I'm a small business, so I know it's a lot easier to work with private companies because I can talk to the CEO. I can find out if they have the money, if they're going to write the check. Whereas it's a lot harder to do that in a bigger business. So I think you make a great point. Is that they're probably large bureaucratic, and they just have to getting things through the works is difficult, and getting outsiders in is always tricky, and everything's slow. So, but I do think that's interesting from a broader market perspective. I think, I mean, if you're listening to the market and you're reading the Wall Street Journal, or the Financial Times, or Bloomberg or CNBC, you would think that everybody just turned overnight and that we're just measuring everything. We've just solved this problem and we've reduced our emissions. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. But I also am a little bit, as you said, you mentioned greenwashing, Dave. And I think that the companies have to be cognizant as well, given that these are largely engineers. They know what they're doing in terms of production, consumption. And I mean, Oxy, the headline today was that I believe Wall Street Journal's headline was Oxy is sucking carbon from the air so they can produce more oil. So, I mean, the fact that these are the statements that, I mean, if you look at the actual CO2 emissions from all the aggressive plans by Excel and all the other utility companies, EIA has done some great job on this. Their emissions reduction is very, very little. And that's from pulling coal-fired power plant out, getting them out of the grid as quickly as they can, shoving renewables in. They still haven't been able to decarbonize. And I'm curious if that's something that some operators are seeing as well. If they're going to start, when the street's going to say, hey, well, what have you done? They're going to say, oh, well, we dropped a smidgen, but that smidgen, I mean, it's probably very little. And U.S. oil and gas production doesn't contribute as the production aspect. I believe from a CO2 emissions perspective, is 1% of U.S. total emissions. Now, methane, I know, is a trickier and different story, but I'm just wondering if there may be a reality check of, hey, these numbers might not sound good because we haven't reduced them as much as we thought we would, or we're worried how that will look to the street.
So, just real quick, I mean, if people think carbon capture technologies are going to be used to suck CO2 out of the air and reverse climate change, which feels like more than not, I talk to people and they feel like, oh, yeah, no, like, oh, carbon capture, we'll just take it out of the air and it will be fine. Like, definitely not the case. I think the narrative on CCS has probably been lost a little bit. But on data and reporting, like I think the regulatory ask and the public expectation versus what is possible right now is not aligned, right? And like
Right.
there are some like programs like the EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program that is very much a regimented, everyone does it the same way. But for a lot of these ESG and total emission inventory rollups, there is still a sizable disconnect in reporting standards and how company A versus company B reports, rolls up and characterizes and reports what emissions factors are you using relative to measure data. Um, I think it makes it really hard right now for us to have an apples to apples conversation about these inventories. And I think that really is tripping a lot of people up.
Yeah, I agree, and that's also why I just tell people it's not to pot. It's, companies can do what they want, and you can always, bettering and doing things is fine. But I just caution of when you start going down this line of how far you go with it, and then it's crude oil production, and then it's when you give a mouse a cookie, they want a glass of milk, and so oil companies have been and gas companies have been very clear that we're okay with scope 1 and scope 2. I mean, I don't necessarily think they should be necessarily, but they're not okay with scope 3 emissions. Well, the folks that are asking for scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are also asking for scope 3 emissions, which is your end user emissions, which is driving the car down the road and the tailpipe emissions of that crude oil. There's a great, and I talked about this last podcast, but the JP Morgan report on their energy transition paper is actually the data in it is phenomenal. I disagree with the cover of it and their initial 2 pages on how they characterize the energy transition in adolescence. I don't think it's in adolescence. I think it's pretty much on life support. But I disagree with that characterization and that push. But the data in it is really, really good. And so they talk a ton about, they do talk about carbon capture. They hit on every major thing and they have really, really good charts to show it. And they basically, the whole point is things are not aligned, right? The ability to put this into place is going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible. They don't come out and say, hey, this is impossible. They let you draw their own conclusion pretty quickly from their data and charts. But it's a lot of the stuff that folks look at. So I think it's just one of those things from an energy security standpoint. I think about is if you end up starting to, my point is you end up if oil companies start doing this or they start moving around their crude oil, and I know Oxy's and a few others have dabbled in that, where they're selling their crude oil directly to United, and then you get on a United plane and they're bragging about their lower emissions crude oil. I mean, the reality is in a 100 million barrel a day market, this is drop in the bucket. And again, if U.S. production, if 1% of our CO2 emissions are from U.S. oil and gas production, I don't think it's really moving the needle here. So we have to just be careful. And I think that we export between 3 and 4 million barrels a day crude oil. So we have to be cautious about, how much we don't want to restrict that oil on the water, or that's going to impact, the price of crude oil globally. And countries need this crude oil to just stabilize the market. And the same thing goes for gas, of how critically, to me, especially the name of that forum was responsible gas. And it's so critical to me. And I believe I said on my panel very loudly that responsible gas is getting every damn molecule we can out of the ground in the US and getting on the water and exporting it. Because that's responsible gas. So that doesn't mean you do this crazy willy-nilly and you have problems. And I believe in safety and management and everything, and doing this environmentally friendly way. But it means that you have to be conscious that where these regulations are from and if they're intended to help the business, enable the business, or prevent the business. And that's just reality of politics. A lot of this stuff is not to enable the business; it's to hold it back.
Yeah, one of the things that you said there is whether or not it's trying to hurt it or help it. We have the pleasure of working with a lot of government agencies in development of their standards. And what we hear behind the scenes is these folks have never faced uh, the pushback that they have like they are now. They have a lot of folks that it's totally agenda based in how they're approaching the regs that are being written. And instead of trying to work to find a place that will work for both government and industry, they want to push
Right.
as far as they can, which is more about, I apologize, for hurting the industry than it is for trying to find something that is responsible, does work well, does provide us with the numbers that we need, and allows us to produce in a responsible manner. That's not the driving force, it appears.
Right, and I think you see that. I mean, and I encourage people to look into this because this isn't just free talking. This is supported by the politics in Colorado. I mean, SB 181 was legislature that was pushed through Colorado. Um, the voters in Colorado voted down Proposition 112, which was an aggressive setback measure to prevent 2,000 feet from a house to prevent, which would have effectively really reduced drilling and completion activity in Colorado because it was 2,000 feet away from homes. A lot of this geology tends to be actually, it's close to urban areas. It's just a reality situation. Um, Good or bad, it's what it is. Now, Proposition 112 was defeated. However, when Jared Polis came into office, he made it very clear in his interviews, and he's making it abundantly clear now how he feels about natural gas. And I know how everybody says he's a bipartisan guy, but I don't care if he says he is. He also says gas is unreliable, which is a pretty damning thing to say. But I think politically, SB 181 was shoved through, and that was essentially the same thing as Proposition 112. There's been studies done on the reduction of drilling completion activity in Colorado because of the slowdown in permits. So SB 181, Colorado Oil and Gas Commission have changed the way they permit oil and gas wells. It's no longer a business, and I found that really really interesting to think about. Of whether you agree with it or disagree with it, it's politically motivated. And so they basically taken in politics into that permitting process. And now it's no longer about, permitting oil and gas wells. It's about the environmental side of this. So that reigns the day, and it's significantly reduced the amount of permits that are approved. And so, and I think everybody in that process will tell you it's political because this is the politics of the day, and that's just fact. But the problem with that is there's not a lot of engineers that were part of SB 181. There weren't, and there are not a lot of engineers that are part of these big political movements for the energy transition for ESG. And so the practicalities and the implementation of this stuff is simply not realistic. And so that's why I've been trying to bring this up quite a bit on the podcast, but um, I tell people this in person, especially in pretty wide ranging groups like the Responsible Gas Forum and others, is that this industry isn't necessarily anti all this stuff. It's just that
Right.
there tends to be a lot of it very intelligent, thought provoking, thoughtful people in this industry. When you give them a problem, they go solve it. And as I did the day Biden came into office, I'm ripping through data and looking at everything and looking at these plans and studying it, and they seem nearly impossible from a physics standpoint. And so folks in the industry look at the CO2 emissions, and all you have to do is start studying CO2 emissions and looking at it globally, and you realize that our CO2 emissions have been declining, and China's have been rising, and India's have been rising. And so it's really a disheartening argument to have of, okay, well, what more can we do? Sure, certainly there's more that can be done, but if we go down the path of Europe, that's a completely different story, and that's going to be a mess. But this is really vulnerable from an energy security standpoint, national security, economic security, and so I think it is deeply political, and that's something that people just have to be honest with themselves about. It doesn't mean that you can't have a thoughtful conversation, but some of the stuff is, ruled by politics, not reality.
I was coming home from Dubai last year, and yeah, it feels like the conversation's emotional, right? And there's no, I forget the saying, no logical argument that can beat an emotional argument. And for a lot of people now, it has become emotional, and people are, I think, generally recklessly ignorant to things that are going on beyond our borders. And I don't even think me working in the industry, being someone who has an appreciation and deep understanding of climate and how climate mechanics work. Coming back from Dubai, it was a 1 a.m. flight, and I'm, wide awake. It's 2:30 in the morning. We're an hour in, and I look out my window, and it looks like the sun's coming up. And I'm like, man, that is freaking weird. Like, it's 2:30 in the morning. Why is the sun coming up over? And then it dawned on me, we were approaching the South Iraqi oil fields, Basra,
Yep.
and it wasn't the sun, it was the glow of some of the biggest flares I have
Yep.
ever seen in my life. I mean, and
That's a great story.
not just one or two of them, like hundreds of like 10-story flares. I mean, you're 40,000 feet up, and you're just looking down, and you can count individual flares because they're so damn big. And it hit home for me the true scale of the problem, right? Like, every environmentalist should go see what is going on in places like Iraq and then come back and give the US industry a gigantic hug.
That's a really good point, and I think it's something people talk about, but they always say, well, the U.S. needs to lead, and it's like, well, the U.S. is leading, and the problem is that when you demonize the countries like the U.S. and Canada, and Canadian oil sands have always done this of when they give you the emissions data. I mean, Canada was always I studied the Canadian oil sands, was very fascinated by it, but they were very forthcoming with their emissions from mined bitumen and from bitumen produced from SAGD and in situ and the stuff that's actually they're producing from under the ground with steam assisted gravity drainage. They were very forthcoming with that data, and I thought, well, the more forthcoming they are, the more damning it is, because Nigeria flares all of their gas. They do not give you the emissions data on that. We know Iraq flares all their gas. We know that there's a problem in Iran and Iraq for gas. They need natural gas. We know that the Saudis are going after the Jafurah Basin, the unconventional stuff, is largely about gas, because if these countries, and this is amazing to think about, folks, where you find oil, you tend to find gas. I mean, it's just shocking, but this is what
Shocking.
happens. And when you produce oil, water comes up, gas comes up, stuff comes up with it. And in the U.S., we have so much damn 120 BCF a day of natural gas production because it's associated. Well, guess what? In these other parts of the world, they also have associated production. We just don't see it because they never built out the infrastructure. Because unlike crude oil, you can't put it in a truck and you can't put it in a tank. You have to pipe this, and you have to. I mean, natural gas is you have to compress it, you have to handle it appropriately, and you have to move it to places. I mean, most parts. When I was in Saudi Arabia in 2017, they did not have running. They don't have piped running water. They have a truck that's going into their houses and filling water on top of their house. If you are in Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia, by the way, the one telling us, doing their peace deal with Iran, backed by China, and saying that they're now going to be the finance hub of the world, and they got their 2030 vision and everything. This is a country in Riyadh, in the center of the country, the capital, where they don't have flowing water. Again, it's a desert, and there's issues with that. But if they don't have flowing water, you can understand that it's hard to build natural gas pipelines, and they haven't done that, even though it's in their benefit to do so. So, we don't measure all this stuff from elsewhere. That's why it's really important to think about, the important. That's why I pull it all the way back and say the importance of producing molecules in oil and gas in democratic countries where you have rule of law, you have this transparency, you have this data, and you can actually do something. Now, whether or not we're going to change the world, from a climate standpoint and the weather by aggressively reducing our emissions on production, that may be another story. That doesn't mean I should poo-poo people for doing it if that's what you want to do. But it is important to think about the economics of it, and does it impact production levels. So that's a flares in Iraq. That's a really, really good story. Dave, follow up comments?
Nope.
Um,
It's
Go ahead. Go ahead.
everything that you just said, I think, is the frustration that we face every day here in our country. Is, the operators do try and do it right, despite what people think. They are trying to operate as cleanly as possible within the economics that they have, and to be demonized when we are producing it way cleaner than most any other country out there. It's maddening sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that's where Colorado really, the interesting is, Colorado has had some of the most stringent air quality standards for production and in the world, actually. So it is a really unique place to come look at in terms of how it's done. Now, I think that I wouldn't say that alone has impacted the space for production in Colorado. But I think there's been an uphill battle in Colorado for increasing production and getting permits and everything. Now it's always been a harsher regulatory battle as the politics have influenced where the state's going. But I think given that you guys seem interested, and we'll close it with this. But I think one, I hear your frustrations because obviously, people listen to the podcast stuff. So I'm well aware of the industry's frustrations. And I do think more has to be done because I think we go back and forth on debating on, I think, as an industry, whether or not education is worth it. And I think, you know, maybe it won't work, but it has to be done. We have to, we can't just allow an emotional argument to win when there's so much at stake from a global standpoint that will probably force our hand. And I bring that up because, if you've been following the stuff with Japan, so Japan, they came out last week, I believe, and or the week before, and they said that they were talking about the importance of natural gas and the need to import liquefied natural gas. And I believe that they sort of had, from what I have heard from various sources, is that Japan has been pushing the Biden administration to have in the G7 communique that the need for investing in oil and gas production globally. And the Biden administration did not want that they didn't want the oil and gas production in there. Now, so Japan kind of came out on their own and said, we're going to need natural gas for a while. So that this is important. And then this article by Bloomberg says G7 nations tussle over bid to phase out coal power by 2030. And so if you read it in the back end, I mean, it's very interesting because they're criticizing the G7 for not phasing out coal power because even the US and parts of Europe have been reluctant to say, yes, we're definitely going to phase out coal power by 2030. And that's because, I mean, I think, just pulling that out of their systems, they realize that's going to be a problem. But in Japan, it's interesting because obviously they're trying to bring back their nuclear. And I think the last part is interesting because it says, and I'm quoting this, amid Russia's war in Ukraine, Japan also has encouraged language supporting investments in oil and natural gas, to the point I was saying, to, quote, bridge the gap, securing affordable energy supplies, an effort that dovetails with an appeal by many U.S. business groups. But several countries have pushed back, with the U.S. encouraging a caveat that natural gas should be a transition energy source only, quote, for those countries that can afford it and are committed to a shift toward net zero energy. And I think this gets really tricky with countries that, who are the countries that are going to lock onto this of these net zero emissions, which we all know net zero by 2050 is a pretty illogical goal. But the folks going to lock onto this because the UK has said they want everyone to sign on to what they did, which is legally binding to phase all this stuff out by 2030. And we all know, I mean, it's sort of impossible to do without natural gas. And so I think this is where your business and the measurement piece becomes very important, is that, are we, is Europe measuring everything? One, that would be interesting. But if we're measuring everything, if everyone else is doing this stuff, I mean, maybe there's opportunities for measurement abroad and everything. I guess you're measuring that flared gas in Iraq, so that would be interesting. But it's just really critical because we're playing whack-a-mole here, and this natural gas, the more this, I think, is encouraged on the phase out of coal, the more there's going to be a need for natural gas. And then when natural gas spikes, then you're going to have more of a need for oil, and you're just going to continue this inevitability, which is not something that's been, I think, well thought about in terms of how the use cases and how the spikes are going to go for natural gas. So just curious as your thoughts on that, how you guys think about it in your business.
Andrew?
I mean, if you're asking, how we look at international markets for, measurement, applicability, we're always evaluating international markets, specifically really interested in Canada, environmentally savvy markets. So, is that kind of along the lines of what you're asking, is like our views on the international markets?
I was it was kind of twofold in my head. It was a little broad. I was thinking, one, yes, your views on the international market. And I was thinking creatively of bringing that back home to close, of saying, are you present in international markets? Are you interested? And are you in the companies that you're working with, whether it's for oil or gas on this measurement stuff, is there an agenda in mind with some of these companies to act for export certification? For countries that are importing it and want to have those certification. Is that something actually that you guys have those discussions? And I know that might be proprietary, but is that something that businesses, that's what they're thinking about, as opposed to just ticking a box for state compliance or U.S. compliance.
Yeah, so that makes more sense now. So, I think Dave alluded to it earlier in the conversation, right? Like we would love to be put and set up in a position like that, right? Like we are a testing, inspection, certification company, compliance company that it's in our DNA to be there at that level, looking at, being able to apply standard and be a certifying measurement body for exports. But the problem is, very few of those right now are interested in real data. Like we've approached a couple companies that are very active in this, and they're like, yeah, the data's great, but these emissions factors are still the way of the land. And what we'd really love for you guys to do is, you know, create a black box mystery algorithm with the SPL stamp of approval that says, this is responsibly sourced gas, sell it at a premium to Germany, right? Um, we believe that the data is key, as we've been talking about this whole conversation. The data is key, and the measurement is really the truth. And until until more people, I think, appreciate that, um, we'll still be kind of working with our finger on the pulse in that area, Dave.
I was just going to say, I love what you just said, and it's so true. That one company, they wanted the SPL stamp because there's a weight that's carried behind that because of
Right.
what we do and our size and our reputation, but they didn't want the actual data.
They
It's
didn't
like,
give a
okay,
shit about
wait a
the
minute.
data.
How can you get our certification without us providing the data that we feel comfortable giving that SPL
Right.
stamp? It was hilarious.
Yeah, and that's a great anecdote and point. But so I mean, do you have you had any foreign entity like European countries willing to coming to you or talking to you about that? Because this is where I say about the build out of the market that I get slightly anxious when we always see, and I know that there's always a chicken and egg thing. So and that's how natural businesses work. So you start it and then you say, okay, it's here, and we've got the Europeans saying we're interested in all the certification, but you also have the Europeans very hesitant on signing these long-term LNG contracts, and so you really do have the market in kind of a very tricky situation. I know we've kind of focused heavily on natural gas because. But I mean, obviously, oil matters a ton, and we haven't heard nearly the pressure abroad on oil because nobody's willing to say, "Hey, America, can you please pull those few million barrels a day off the global market?" No, they don't want to do that, but they're willing to pressure us on that gas because it's only a 50 BCF a day market right now for the water LNG on the water, so it's something slightly more nimble. But that's why I'm just curious of if there's any. I don't know if they've reached out to you directly, but if unless those things are happening and they're saying, hey, Germany or whoever, we like the SPL seal of approval, we'll take that, and this will work. You could really develop that market and then help these guys, get that molecule to market.
Yeah, without breaking confidence, Trisha, most of the conversations we've had have been North American centric.
Okay. Okay, that's fair. Um, and I'll have to find somebody maybe on the global side to touch base on that. But and I mean, I think globally, I think we have heard the European Commission talk about this stuff, whether or not they implement it, and clearly they didn't. This is something I always bring up is people always say, "Where's Europe going with their energy policy?" And yes, they say a lot, but if they can't access the correct fuels, they tend to just do whatever they need to do to turn the lights on,
Yep.
which is what we saw over the course of the last a couple years. So, yeah, I appreciate your candidness.
Yeah, no problem.
All right. Well, we have hit on 58 minutes here, so we should probably close up. And but I really appreciate all of your guys' time. If you have any last minute thoughts, I'd happy to hear them. But thank you guys so much for coming on the podcast.
Appreciate the opportunity for you to let us come on. And yeah, like I hope I'll get to see you here. We're gonna you're gonna be doing the Rocky Mountain Measurement Society
Absolutely.
doing their luncheon here later this month. So excited to meet you in person and keep the conversation going. You do a great job advocating for the industry, and it was a real privilege to be on.
Yeah,
Thank you. Well,
likewise.
awesome.
I
Well, it was
truly,
really sorry. Go
I'm,
ahead, Dave.
I just say, just echoing what he says, really appreciate the opportunity. You're a great voice for the industry. We need more folks like you. So thank you for what you're doing.
Well, I appreciate that immensely, and I'm really looking forward to the Rocky Mountain Measurement Society, which is just the nerdiness of this business is fantastic. And I'd love to be involved in this. And we didn't talk about China on this podcast at all. So I will make sure in that April 27th meeting with the Rocky Mountain Measurement Society, we will be talking about China plenty. So don't worry about that. And I did talk about it in the last podcast in depth. So, but thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it, and absolutely look forward to the meeting and any other events we have upcoming in the future. Maybe with the gas processing association that we talked about earlier.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks, Trisha.
Take care.